In the misty streets of 18th-century Königsberg, Prussia, something extraordinary was happening. Each morning at precisely 5 o'clock, as the Baltic wind swept through the cobblestone streets and merchants began preparing their wares for another day of commerce, a small, thin man would rise from his bed with the precision of clockwork itself. His name was Immanuel Kant, and though he would never travel more than 40 miles from the city of his birth, this unremarkable-looking professor was quietly orchestrating one of the most profound intellectual revolutions in human history. Picture, if you will, the Prussia of 1724, the year of Kant's birth. It was a world still largely medieval in its thinking, where royal authority was considered divinely ordained, where scientific inquiry was viewed with suspicion by religious authorities, and where most people lived and died within walking distance of where they were born. The great questions that had puzzled humanity for millennia: what can we truly know? What should we do? What is beauty? What may we hope for? Were still answered primarily by appeal to ancient authorities or religious doctrine. Yet, in this provincial corner of the Holy Roman Empire, in a city that most Europeans would have struggled to locate on a map, a revolution was brewing. It was not the kind of revolution that would storm palaces or topple governments, though its effects would ultimately prove far more lasting. It was a revolution of the mind, carried out by a man whose most daring adventure was his daily walk to the same tree and back, whose greatest excitement was the arrival of the latest philosophical treatise from distant universities, and whose most radical act was thinking with a precision and depth that would fundamentally alter humanity's understanding of reality itself. The story of Immanuel Kant is the story of how the most extraordinary ideas can emerge from the most ordinary circumstances, how the deepest questions about existence can be explored not in exotic locations or through dramatic adventures, but in the quiet solitude of a study, through the disciplined routine of daily reflection, and in the patient work of a mind utterly committed to understanding truth. It is the story of how a man who never left his hometown became the architect of a new way of seeing the universe, and ourselves within it. Immanuel Kant entered the world on April 22, 1724, in Königsberg, Prussia, the fourth of 9 children born to Johann Georg Kant, a harness maker, and Anna Regina Reuter. His family belonged to the Pietist movement, a form of Protestantism that emphasized personal devotion, moral purity, and the direct experience of faith over elaborate theological doctrine. This early exposure to Pietism would profoundly influence Kant's later philosophical development, particularly his conviction that moral law must be grounded in something deeper than mere convention or personal preference. The Königsberg of Kant's youth was a fascinating crossroads of cultures and ideas. As a major port city on the Baltic Sea, it welcomed merchants and scholars from across Northern Europe. German, Polish, Lithuanian, and Russian could be heard in its markets, while its university attracted students from throughout the Germanic world. The city bore the architectural marks of its complex history. Gothic churches stood alongside Baroque palaces, while narrow medieval streets opened onto grand squares designed in the latest continental fashion. Young Immanuel was a brilliant but sickly child, small for his age and plagued by health problems that would follow him throughout his life. His mother, Anna, recognized his intellectual gifts early and was determined that he should receive the best education possible. When he was 8 years old, she enrolled him in the Collegium Fredericianum, a Pietist school known for its rigorous academic standards and moral discipline. At the Collegium, Kant excelled in Latin, which was still the language of scholarly discourse, and showed particular aptitude for mathematics and natural philosophy, what we would now call science. But it was his encounter with classical literature that first awakened his philosophical sensibilities. Reading Lucretius's On the Nature of Things, he began to grapple with fundamental questions about the nature of reality, the reliability of sensory experience, and humanity's place in the natural order. His teachers noted something unusual about young Kant's approach to learning. While other students memorized and recited, Kant questioned and analyzed. He wanted to understand not just what the great authorities said, but why they said it and whether their reasoning was sound. This critical attitude would become the hallmark of his mature philosophy, but it sometimes put him at odds with educational methods that emphasized obedience and acceptance of established doctrine. When Kant was 13, tragedy struck the family. His beloved mother Anna died, leaving a profound impact on the young philosopher-to-be. Years later, he would write that he had never forgotten her influence, crediting her with instilling in him both intellectual curiosity and moral seriousness. Her death also brought home to him the fragility of human existence and the importance of making one's life count for something meaningful. In 1740, at the age of 16, Kant entered the University of Königsberg. This was still an era when universities were small, intimate institutions where students and professors knew each other personally, where learning took place through direct dialogue and debate rather than large lecture halls. The University of Königsberg, founded in 1544, was particularly renowned for its theological and philosophical faculties, making it an ideal environment for a young man beginning to wrestle with life's deepest questions. Kant's university years were transformative in ways both intellectual and personal. He studied under Martin Knutzen, a professor of logic and metaphysics who introduced him to the works of Christian Wolff, a German philosopher who had attempted to create a comprehensive philosophical system based on mathematical reasoning. From Knutzen, Kant learned the importance of systematic thinking and logical rigor, lessons that would prove crucial to his later revolutionary achievements. But perhaps even more important was Kant's discovery of Newton's Principia Mathematica and the broader scientific revolution that was transforming European thought. The success of Newtonian physics in explaining and predicting natural phenomena raised profound philosophical questions. If the natural world operated according to mathematical laws that human reason could discover, what did this mean for traditional beliefs about knowledge, causation, and human freedom? These questions would haunt Kant for the rest of his life and ultimately drive him to develop his critical philosophy. During his student years, Kant also encountered the works of British empiricists like John Locke and David Hume. Their arguments that all knowledge comes from sensory experience challenged the rationalist tradition he had inherited from his German teachers. This tension between rationalism and empiricism, between the claims of reason and experience, would become central to Kant's philosophical project. Financial constraints forced Kant to leave the university before completing his degree, and for nearly a decade he worked as a private tutor for wealthy families in the Königsberg region. This period of his life, though professionally humble, was intellectually crucial. Working with students of various ages and abilities taught him how to explain complex ideas clearly and systematically. More importantly, the relative isolation gave him time to read widely and think deeply about the philosophical problems that fascinated him. It was during these tutoring years that Kant began to develop his distinctive approach to philosophical questions. Rather than simply choosing sides in existing debates, he began to ask whether the debates themselves were properly framed. Instead of asking whether rationalism or empiricism was correct, he began to wonder whether both might be partially right and partially wrong, and whether a new framework might be needed to resolve their conflict. In 1755, Kant returned to the University of Königsberg to complete his degree and begin his academic career. He would remain associated with the university for the rest of his working life, slowly climbing the academic ladder from private lecturer to full professor. This might seem like the beginning of a quiet, uneventful career, but it was during these early years that Kant began developing the ideas that would revolutionize philosophy. As a young lecturer, Kant taught an extraordinary variety of subjects: logic, metaphysics, moral philosophy, natural philosophy, mathematics, geography, anthropology, and even military fortification. This breadth of teaching forced him to think about the connections between different areas of human knowledge and experience. How did mathematical reasoning relate to moral judgment? What was the connection between physical science and human psychology? These questions of systematic unity would become central to his mature philosophy. But it was Kant's establishment of his famous daily routine during these years that would become legendary throughout Königsberg and beyond. Rising each morning at precisely 5 o'clock, Kant would begin his day with what he called his coffee, tobacco, and meditation ritual. Sitting in his dressing gown before a small table near his bedroom window, he would drink 2 cups of weak tea, despite calling it his coffee ritual, smoke a single pipe of tobacco, and spend an hour in quiet reflection on the day's intellectual tasks ahead. By 7 o'clock, he was dressed and ready to deliver his morning lectures at the university. Contemporary accounts describe Kant as an engaging and popular teacher, despite his small stature and somewhat formal manner. Students appreciated his clarity of explanation and his willingness to engage with their questions, even when those questions challenged accepted doctrine. His lectures on anthropology and geography were particularly popular, as Kant had a remarkable ability to bring distant lands and peoples to life for students who, like himself, had never traveled far from home. After his morning teaching duties, Kant would return home for what he considered the most important part of his day: his writing and research. Working in his study, a small, spartanly furnished room with a desk positioned to catch the northern light, he would spend the morning hours wrestling with philosophical problems. This was not casual reflection but intensive, systematic work. Kant wrote and rewrote his thoughts repeatedly, organizing and reorganizing his arguments, searching for the clearest and most compelling way to express his insights. The discipline of this routine was extraordinary. Day after day, year after year, Kant would sit at the same desk, working through the same fundamental questions with relentless patience and precision. He understood that revolutionary ideas do not emerge from sudden flashes of inspiration but from the slow, methodical work of thinking through problems with complete thoroughness. As he once wrote to a friend, "The greatest honor I can give to my ideas is to subject them to the most rigorous criticism I can devise." At precisely 1 o'clock each day, Kant would break from his solitary work for lunch and social company. Despite his reputation as a dry academic, he was actually quite gregarious and loved good conversation. He would invite friends, colleagues, and visiting scholars to join him for elaborate midday meals that often lasted 2 or 3 hours. These gatherings were famous throughout Königsberg for their intellectual vigor and good humor. Kant's dinner parties followed certain unwritten rules that reflected his philosophical temperament. First, the conversation should never focus exclusively on academic subjects. Kant believed that too much shop talk made for boring company. Second, controversial topics should be explored from all sides, with participants encouraged to defend positions they might not personally hold. Third, humor and wit were not only welcome but essential. Kant believed that laughter was a sign of intellectual health and that people who took themselves too seriously were usually not thinking clearly. These social gatherings served a crucial function in Kant's intellectual development. By explaining his ideas to intelligent non-specialists, he learned to identify the assumptions he was making and the gaps in his reasoning. Many of his philosophical insights first emerged not in the solitude of his study but in the give and take of dinner conversation, as friends challenged his arguments or asked for clarification of difficult points. But it was Kant's afternoon walk that became the stuff of legend in Königsberg. Every day at precisely 3:30 p.m., regardless of weather, Kant would emerge from his house wearing his gray coat and carrying his walking stick. His route never varied, down the Lindenstrasse, across the Cathedral Square, along the Pregel River, and then back home via the same path. The walk took exactly 1 hour, and Kant's punctuality was so reliable that neighbors reportedly set their clocks by his appearance. This daily constitution was not mere exercise but an integral part of Kant's philosophical method. Walking alone, freed from the distractions of books and papers, he could allow his mind to wander freely among the problems he had been working on. Many of his most important insights came during these solitary rambles. The rhythm of walking seemed to help organize his thoughts, while the fresh air and moderate exercise cleared his mind of the confusion that could accumulate during intense study. Local citizens soon learned to recognize the small, thin figure making his deliberate way through the streets. Children would point and whisper as the famous professor passed, while merchants and shopkeepers would nod respectfully. Kant seemed oblivious to the attention, lost in contemplation of questions invisible to his neighbors but of cosmic importance to human understanding. The walk became so central to Kant's routine that he modified it only under the most extreme circumstances. Legend has it that he missed his walk only once in 30 years, when he became so absorbed in reading Rousseau's Emile that he forgot the time entirely. Even in harsh Baltic winters, when snow made walking treacherous and cold winds cut through the heaviest clothing, Kant would complete his circuit, sometimes walking slowly and carefully but never abandoning his route entirely. After his walk, Kant would spend the evening reading, not philosophical works which he reserved for his morning writing hours, but literature, history, travel accounts, and contemporary news. He was a voracious reader of newspapers and magazines, staying current with political developments across Europe. This broad reading fed into his philosophical work in subtle but important ways, helping him understand how abstract philosophical questions connected to practical human concerns. By 10 o'clock each evening, Kant would retire to his bedroom, ending a day structured with mathematical precision. This routine, maintained with only minor variations for decades, provided the stable foundation for one of the most productive and revolutionary careers in intellectual history. Far from being a sign of obsessive-compulsive rigidity, Kant's routine was a conscious strategy for maximizing his philosophical productivity. By eliminating decision-making about trivial daily matters, he freed his mental energy for the deep thinking that his philosophical project required. The turning point in Kant's intellectual development came in the 1760s, when he encountered the work of David Hume, the Scottish philosopher whose skeptical arguments would awaken him from his dogmatic slumber. Hume's devastating critique of traditional philosophical assumptions about causation, induction, and the self forced Kant to confront fundamental questions about the nature and limits of human knowledge. Hume had argued that we can never actually observe causal connections between events. We only observe that certain events regularly follow others. When we say that fire causes smoke, we are really saying that we have repeatedly observed smoke following fire, but we have no logical justification for assuming that this pattern will continue or that there is any necessary connection between these events. This argument threatened the entire edifice of rational knowledge, since most of what we take ourselves to know depends on assumptions about causal relationships. Even more disturbing was Hume's argument about induction, the process by which we form generalizations based on particular observations. When we conclude that all swans are white because we have seen many white swans and no non-white ones, we are making an inductive inference. But Hume showed that there is no logical justification for such inferences. The fact that our observations have shown a certain pattern gives us no logical reason to assume that unobserved cases will follow the same pattern. These arguments struck at the heart of both common sense and scientific knowledge. If Hume was right, then neither ordinary experience nor sophisticated science could give us reliable knowledge about the world. We might have beliefs and expectations based on habit and custom, but we could never have genuine knowledge about matters of fact. For most philosophers, Hume's skepticism was simply too radical to accept. They preferred to ignore his arguments or dismiss them as clever but ultimately frivolous logical games. But Kant took Hume's challenge seriously, recognizing that any adequate philosophical system would have to address these fundamental epistemological problems. As he later wrote, Hume's arguments interrupted my dogmatic slumber and gave my investigations in the field of speculative philosophy a quite new direction. Kant spent over a decade working out his response to Hume's challenge. The solution he eventually developed was revolutionary in its implications, though it emerged from the most patient and systematic thinking. Instead of trying to refute Hume's arguments directly, Kant accepted their force and asked a different question. Given that Hume's skeptical arguments are logically valid, how is it possible that we do have knowledge, as we clearly do in mathematics and natural science? This shift in perspective was Kant's crucial insight. Instead of asking whether we can have knowledge, he asked how knowledge is possible given that we clearly do have it. This approach allowed him to accept Hume's negative conclusions about the limits of traditional philosophical methods while developing a new framework for understanding how human cognition actually works. The key to Kant's solution was his recognition that human minds are not passive recipients of sensory information but active processors that contribute something essential to experience itself. When we perceive objects in space and time, when we recognize causal relationships, when we organize our experience into coherent patterns, we are not simply recording what is given to us from outside. Instead, we are actively structuring our experience according to fundamental principles that belong to the nature of human cognition itself. This was Kant's Copernican revolution in philosophy. Just as Copernicus had solved astronomical problems by proposing that the Earth revolves around the Sun rather than vice versa, Kant proposed that objects conform to our knowledge rather than our knowledge conforming to objects. The basic structures we find in experience. Spatial and temporal organization, causal relationships, logical consistency, reflect the way human minds necessarily organize information rather than features of reality independent of our cognitive apparatus. This revolutionary idea allowed Kant to thread the needle between dogmatism and skepticism. Against the dogmatists, he agreed that we cannot have knowledge of things as they are independent of our cognitive apparatus, what he called things in themselves or noumena. But against the skeptics, he argued that we can have genuine knowledge of things as they appear to us, phenomena, because the basic structures of phenomenal experience are contributed by our own cognitive apparatus and are therefore knowable a priori. After more than a decade of intensive work, Kant published his masterpiece, The Critique of Pure Reason, in 1781. This massive and complex work attempted nothing less than a complete analysis of the nature, scope, and limits of human knowledge. It was, as Kant himself recognized, a work of unprecedented ambition and difficulty, one that would require readers to think in entirely new ways about fundamental philosophical questions. The Critique of Pure Reason is structured like a legal proceeding, with reason itself placed on trial. Kant's goal was to determine precisely what reason can and cannot legitimately claim to know, establishing secure boundaries beyond which rational inquiry cannot trespass. This was not a skeptical exercise designed to undermine confidence in knowledge, but rather a critical examination aimed at putting knowledge on firmer foundations by clearly understanding its proper domain. Kant began with a detailed analysis of human sensibility, our capacity to receive sensory information. His crucial insight was that space and time are not properties of things as they exist independently of our perception, but rather forms of human sensory intuition. We cannot perceive anything except as located in space and time, not because all real objects are spatial and temporal, but because spatial and temporal organization are necessary conditions of human sensory experience. This was a startling conclusion with profound implications. It meant that the geometrical properties of space and the temporal sequences we observe in nature reflect the structure of human perception rather than the intrinsic nature of reality. Euclidean geometry is necessarily true of all possible human experience, not because space itself is Euclidean, but because human sensibility necessarily organizes sensory information according to Euclidean principles. But sensory intuition, even organized by spatial and temporal forms, cannot by itself constitute knowledge. For that, we need concepts that allow us to recognize patterns and relationships in our sensory experience. Kant's analysis of human understanding, our capacity to think conceptually about what we perceive, led to his famous table of categories, a systematic list of the fundamental concepts that human beings necessarily employ in organizing experience. These categories, including causation, substance, unity, plurality, reality, and negation, are not learned from experience but are rather the conditions that make experience possible in the first place. When we recognize that one event causes another, we are not simply observing a relationship that exists independently in nature. Instead, we are actively organizing our sensory experience according to the concept of causation that belongs to the essential structure of human understanding. This analysis allowed Kant to solve the problem of induction that had troubled Hume. We can be confident that future experience will exhibit causal relationships, not because nature itself necessarily exhibits such relationships, but because human understanding necessarily organizes all possible experience according to causal concepts. The laws of nature are not features of things in themselves, but rather necessary conditions of possible human experience. Kant's solution to Hume's problem was thus both more modest and more ambitious than traditional approaches. It was more modest because it gave up the claim to knowledge of things as they are independent of human cognition. But it was more ambitious because it claimed that within the domain of possible human experience, we could have genuinely universal and necessary knowledge. The critique of pure reason also contained Kant's devastating critique of traditional metaphysics. The great metaphysical systems of the past had claimed to provide knowledge about God, the soul, and the cosmos as a whole through pure rational argument. Kant showed that such claims inevitably lead to contradictions and paradoxes, not because reason is defective, but because it is being applied beyond its proper domain. When reason attempts to think about totalities that can never be given in experience, like the universe as a whole or the complete nature of the soul, it falls into what Kant called antinomies, pairs of arguments that lead to contradictory conclusions with equal logical force. These antinomies showed that pure reason, when applied beyond the bounds of possible experience, inevitably overreaches its capabilities. But Kant's critique of traditional metaphysics was not entirely negative. By showing the limits of theoretical reason, he was making room for faith by demonstrating that theoretical arguments against the existence of God, free will, or the immortality of the soul were just as illegitimate as arguments in favor of these ideas. The failure of dogmatic metaphysics opened space for a different approach to these ultimate questions, one based on practical rather than theoretical reason. While Kant was revolutionizing theoretical philosophy in his critique of pure reason, he was simultaneously developing an equally radical approach to moral philosophy. His Critique of Practical Reason, published in 1788, attempted to establish ethics on a foundation of pure rational principle rather than empirical observation, cultural tradition, or religious authority. Kant's approach to ethics began with his analysis of moral experience itself. When we make moral judgments, he argued, we are not simply expressing our preferences or describing our feelings. Instead, we are making claims that we take to be universally valid and objectively binding. When we say that lying is wrong, we are not just saying that we personally dislike lying or that our society disapproves of it. We are claiming that lying is wrong for anyone, anywhere, regardless of their personal desires or cultural background. This objectivity of moral judgment posed a philosophical puzzle similar to the problems Kant had addressed in theoretical philosophy. If moral judgments claim universal validity, what could be the source of this universality? Kant argued that it could not come from empirical observation, since empirical observation can only tell us how people actually behave, not how they ought to behave. Neither could it come from cultural tradition or religious authority, since these vary from place to place and time to time. The source of moral universality, Kant concluded, must lie in the nature of rational agency itself. When we act morally, we are acting as rational beings who can step back from our immediate desires and inclinations and ask what principles we can consistently will to be universal laws. This capacity for moral reasoning is not something we learn from experience but is rather a fundamental feature of what it means to be a rational agent. This insight led Kant to formulate his famous categorical imperative, the supreme principle of moral philosophy. Act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. This principle provides a test for determining the moral worth of our actions. Before acting, we should ask ourselves whether we could consistently will that everyone in similar circumstances act according to the same principle. The categorical imperative rules out actions that involve logical contradiction when universalized. Lying, for example, fails this test because if everyone lied whenever it seemed advantageous, the very concept of truth-telling would break down, making lying itself impossible. Promise-breaking similarly fails the test because if everyone broke promises when convenient, the institution of promising would collapse, making promise-breaking self-defeating. But Kant's moral philosophy went deeper than providing a test for individual actions. He argued that morality ultimately requires us to treat humanity, whether in our own person or that of others, always as an end and never merely as a means. This principle of human dignity provides a foundation for understanding why certain actions are wrong even when they might produce good consequences. When we lie to someone, we are treating them merely as a means to our own ends, denying them the respect they deserve as rational agents capable of making their own decisions based on accurate information. When we break promises, we are similarly failing to treat others as ends in themselves, using their trust for our own purposes without regard for their rational autonomy. This emphasis on human dignity and rational autonomy led Kant to develop a conception of moral community that was remarkably progressive for his era. If all rational beings deserve equal respect as ends in themselves, then moral principles must be universal in scope, applying equally to all people regardless of their race, gender, nationality, or social status. The moral law recognizes no arbitrary distinctions among rational agents. Kant's moral philosophy also provided a new way of thinking about human freedom. We are free, he argued, not when we can do whatever we want, but when we can act according to principles that we can rationally endorse. True freedom consists in autonomy, self-legislation according to rational principles, rather than in the mere satisfaction of desires or the absence of external constraints. This conception of freedom allowed Kant to resolve one of the deepest problems in moral philosophy, the apparent conflict between moral responsibility and causal determinism. If our actions are the inevitable result of prior causes, how can we be held responsible for them? Kant's solution was to distinguish between two perspectives on human action. From the perspective of theoretical reason, which studies phenomena as they appear in space and time, human actions are indeed part of the causal order of nature. But from the perspective of practical reason, which considers human beings as rational agents, we must presuppose that we are capable of genuine choice. This distinction allowed Kant to maintain both that natural science correctly describes the phenomenal world as causally determined and that moral responsibility requires genuine freedom. We are simultaneously citizens of two worlds: the natural world studied by science, where everything happens according to causal laws, and the moral world where rational agents make free choices according to self-imposed principles. Kant's third great critical work, The Critique of Judgment, published in 1790, addressed questions of aesthetic experience and teleological judgment that seem to fall between the domains of theoretical and practical reason. How do we judge things to be beautiful or sublime? What does it mean to say that natural organisms are purposively organized? These questions led Kant to develop a sophisticated analysis of human judgment that would prove hugely influential in the development of modern aesthetics. Kant's analysis of beauty began with the recognition that aesthetic judgments have a peculiar logical status. When we call something beautiful, we are not simply describing our personal response to it, as we might when we say something tastes good. Instead, we expect others to share our judgment, even though we cannot provide logical arguments to prove that something is beautiful. Beauty seems to make a claim on universal agreement even though it cannot be demonstrated like a mathematical theorem. This paradox led Kant to analyze the structure of aesthetic experience itself. When we judge something to be beautiful, he argued, we are experiencing a harmonious play between our cognitive faculties, imagination and understanding, without subsuming what we perceive under a determinate concept. This free play of the faculties produces a feeling of pleasure that we expect others to share because it reflects the general structure of human cognition rather than merely personal preferences. Beautiful objects, Kant argued, appear to be purposively organized even though we cannot specify any particular purpose they serve. A beautiful flower seems perfectly designed for some end, but we cannot say what that end might be. This purposiveness without purpose gives beautiful objects their distinctive aesthetic character and explains why aesthetic experience feels both meaningful and mysterious. Kant distinguished beauty from the sublime, another important category of aesthetic experience. While beauty involves harmony and proportion, the sublime involves experiences that initially overwhelm our imaginative capacities. Vast landscapes, powerful storms, the starry heavens, or abstract mathematical concepts like infinity. The sublime begins with a feeling of inadequacy or even fear, but resolves into a recognition of our own supersensible capacities as rational beings. When we stand before a sublime landscape, we initially feel small and insignificant compared to the overwhelming power of nature. But this feeling gives way to an awareness that we can think about infinity, contemplate totalities that no sensory experience could contain, and recognize moral principles that transcend the natural world. The sublime thus reveals our dignity as rational beings who belong to a supersensible realm that cannot be reduced to natural causation. Kant's analysis of aesthetic experience provided a crucial bridge between the domains of nature and freedom. In aesthetic experience, we encounter natural objects that seem to exhibit purposiveness and meaning without being reducible to mechanical causation. This suggests that nature itself might be organized in ways that are compatible with moral purposes, making it reasonable to hope that the natural world can serve as a theater for the realization of moral ideals. This connection between aesthetics and moral philosophy led Kant to develop his doctrine of aesthetic education. Exposure to beautiful art and natural beauty cultivates our capacity for disinterested judgment, the ability to step back from immediate practical concerns and consider things from a broader perspective. This same capacity is essential for moral judgment, which requires us to abstract from our particular desires and consider what we could as universal law. The critique of judgment also addressed questions about natural teleology, the apparent purposiveness we observe in living organisms. When we study a tree, for example, we naturally think of its parts as existing for the sake of the whole. Roots absorb nutrients, leaves capture sunlight, and the trunk supports the entire structure. This teleological thinking seems unavoidable when dealing with biological phenomena, yet it appears to conflict with the mechanistic explanations that Kant had established as the proper domain of natural science. Kant's solution was characteristically subtle. He argued that teleological judgment is a necessary feature of human reasoning about organic phenomena, but it does not provide knowledge about the intrinsic nature of organisms. Instead, it reflects a peculiar need of human understanding to think about certain natural phenomena as if they were designed for purposes, even though we cannot prove that such purposes actually exist. This as if quality of teleological judgment, what Kant called reflective judgment, provided a model for thinking about other areas where human beings seem to require regulative ideas that cannot be established through theoretical knowledge. We must act as if our moral efforts can make a meaningful difference in the world, as if there is ultimate purpose to existence, as if the natural world is hospitable to moral purposes, even though these beliefs cannot be demonstrated through purely theoretical arguments. While Kant was revolutionizing Western philosophy through his critical writings, his personal life in Königsberg continued to follow the precisely ordered routine that had become legendary throughout the city. Visitors from across Europe would come to observe the famous philosopher in his natural habitat, often surprised to discover that this titan of abstract thought was actually a charming and sociable man with wide-ranging interests and a delightful sense of humor. Kant never married, a fact that generated considerable speculation both during his lifetime and after. He himself claimed that when he could afford a wife, he no longer wanted one, and when he wanted a wife, he could no longer afford one. But this humorous deflection concealed a deeper truth about his character. Kant had devoted himself so completely to his philosophical mission that he believed marriage would distract from the intensive focus required for his work. This was not misogyny or fear of intimacy, but rather a conscious choice about how to structure a life dedicated to answering fundamental questions about human existence. Kant maintained close friendships with women throughout his life and was known for his gallant treatment of female dinner guests. He simply recognized that the kind of systematic thinking his philosophical project required was incompatible with the domestic responsibilities that marriage would entail. His household was managed with the same precision that characterized his intellectual work. His longtime servant, Martin Lampy, had been with him for over 40 years and knew exactly how to anticipate the philosopher's needs. Lampy would prepare Kant's simple breakfast, lay out his clothes, and ensure that everything was ready for the day's routine. The relationship between master and servant was formal but warm, based on mutual respect and shared commitment to the orderly functioning of Kant's domestic life. Kant's study, where he produced his revolutionary philosophical works, was spartanly furnished but carefully organized. A simple wooden desk positioned to catch the northern light, bookshelves lined with carefully arranged volumes, a few chairs for the occasional visitor. The room reflected its occupants' belief that external simplicity supported internal complexity. Kant claimed that he could think more clearly when his physical environment was free from unnecessary distractions. The walls of his study were famously bare except for a single image, a portrait of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the French philosopher whose works had profoundly influenced Kant's thinking about moral philosophy and political theory. Kant credited Rousseau with teaching him to respect ordinary human beings and showing him that philosophical wisdom should serve human flourishing rather than mere academic glory. Kant's library revealed the breadth of his intellectual interests. Alongside philosophical classics and contemporary scientific treatises, visitors would find travel literature, historical works, novels, and poetry. He was particularly fond of travel accounts, which allowed him to explore distant lands and exotic cultures without leaving his beloved Königsberg. Through these vicarious journeys, he developed a sophisticated understanding of cultural diversity that influenced his later writings on anthropology and political philosophy. His reading habits were as methodical as everything else in his life. Each evening after dinner, Kant would select books appropriate to his current mood and intellectual needs. Light literature for relaxation, historical works for perspective on contemporary events, scientific treatises for staying current with developments in natural philosophy. He read slowly and carefully, taking notes and reflecting on how new information connected to his ongoing philosophical projects. The famous afternoon walks that made Kant a Königsberg institution were not merely exercise but an integral part of his philosophical method. Walking alone along his invariable route, freed from books and papers, Kant could allow his mind to wander among the problems he had been wrestling with at his desk. The physical rhythm of walking seemed to help organize his thoughts, while the fresh air and gentle exercise cleared away mental fatigue. Local residents soon learned to recognize the small figure in the gray coat making his deliberate way through the streets. Children would point and whisper as the famous professor passed, while merchants and shopkeepers would nod respectfully. Kant appeared oblivious to the attention, lost in contemplation of questions invisible to his neighbors but of cosmic significance for human understanding. The route itself became known as the philosopher's path, and Kant's punctuality was so legendary that townspeople claimed they could set their clocks by his appearance. Only once in 30 years, according to local legend, did he miss his appointed walk, when he became so absorbed reading Rousseau's Emile that he forgot the time entirely. Even in harsh Baltic winters, when snow made walking treacherous and bitter winds cut through the heaviest clothing, Kant would complete his circuit, sometimes walking slowly and carefully but never abandoning his routine entirely. Kant's philosophical interests extended far beyond abstract questions of knowledge and morality to encompass practical questions about politics, law, and international relations. His political writings, particularly his essay Toward Perpetual Peace, 1795, would prove remarkably prescient, anticipating many features of modern international law and democratic theory. Kant's approach to political philosophy began with his analysis of the relationship between individual morality and social institutions. If individuals have a moral duty to treat one another with respect and dignity, then political institutions must be designed to protect and promote this fundamental requirement of moral life. This meant that legitimate political authority must be based on the consent of rational agents rather than mere force or traditional privilege. Kant was thus a strong advocate for republican government, not necessarily in the sense of rejecting monarchy, but in the sense of requiring that political power be exercised according to law and with the participation of citizens in the legislative process. Republican institutions were necessary, he argued, because they alone were compatible with the moral autonomy that rational beings possess as ends in themselves. But Kant's most original contribution to political philosophy concerned international relations. He recognized that even if individual states achieved perfect republican constitutions, they would still exist in a state of nature with respect to one another, with no common authority to resolve disputes peacefully. This international anarchy made war inevitable and undermined the moral progress that republican institutions were supposed to promote. Kant's solution was his proposal for a League of Nations, a voluntary federation of republican states that would resolve disputes through law rather than force. This league would not be a world government with coercive power over its members, but rather a confederation based on shared commitment to peaceful dispute resolution and mutual respect for national sovereignty. The essay Toward Perpetual Peace outlined the conditions Kant believed necessary for lasting international peace. Republican constitutions would make wars less likely because citizens who must bear the costs of war would be reluctant to support military adventures. Free trade would create economic incentives for peaceful cooperation, and gradually expanding federation of peace-loving states would create a zone of law that could eventually encompass the entire globe. Kant understood that this vision was utopian in the sense that its complete realization lay far in the future, if it could be achieved at all. But he argued that it was nonetheless a necessary regulative ideal that should guide political action in the present. Even if perpetual peace could never be perfectly achieved, the attempt to approximate it was a moral duty that followed from our obligation to treat all rational beings with dignity and respect. These political writings revealed another dimension of Kant's revolutionary significance. He was not merely an abstract philosopher concerned with theoretical questions, but a thinker deeply engaged with the practical challenges of his era. His political philosophy provided theoretical foundations for the democratic movements that would transform Europe and America in the generations following his death. In his later years, Kant became increasingly interested in what he called anthropology, the systematic study of human nature from a philosophical perspective. His lectures on anthropology, which he delivered regularly for over 20 years, attracted large audiences of students and townspeople eager to hear the famous philosopher's thoughts on topics closer to everyday experience than the abstract arguments of his critical philosophy. Kant's anthropological investigations began with a simple but profound question: what is the human being? This question encompassed not just the theoretical question of human knowledge or the practical question of moral obligation, but the broader question of humanity's place in nature and history. What distinguishes human beings from other animals? What is the source of human dignity? How should we understand cultural diversity and historical change? Kant's answer began with his analysis of human beings as rational animals, creatures who belong simultaneously to the natural world studied by science and to the moral world governed by principles of freedom. This dual citizenship, he argued, was the source of both human greatness and human misery. We are the only creatures who can step back from immediate instinctual responses and ask whether our actions conform to principles we can rationally endorse. But this same capacity makes us capable of evil in ways that non-rational animals cannot be. The development of reason, Kant argued, was not an unmixed blessing. Rational reflection makes us aware of possibilities beyond our immediate situation, leading to desires that simpler creatures never experience. We become capable of envy, resentment, and sophisticated forms of cruelty precisely because we can imagine alternative ways of being and compare our actual condition to idealized possibilities. But reason also makes possible forms of satisfaction unknown to other animals. We can take pleasure in beauty, find meaning in moral action, and experience the distinctive satisfaction that comes from understanding complex truths. Most importantly, reason allows us to participate in culture, the ongoing human project of creating institutions, practices, and forms of knowledge that transcend the limitations of individual perspective. Kant's anthropological writings explored the mechanisms of cultural development with remarkable sophistication. He argued that progress occurs not despite human selfishness and competition, but because of these seemingly negative traits. What he called unsocial sociability, our tendency to want the company of others while simultaneously wanting to dominate them, creates the tensions that drive cultural innovation and institutional development. Competition forces individuals to develop their talents beyond what mere survival would require. The desire for recognition motivates achievements in art, science, and political organization that benefit humanity as a whole, even though they originate in personal ambition. Conflict between groups stimulates technological innovation and social organization, gradually leading to more sophisticated forms of cooperation. This analysis allowed Kant to view human history as fundamentally progressive, despite its obvious features of violence, injustice, and suffering. Each generation builds on the achievements of previous generations, gradually developing more sophisticated forms of knowledge, more effective institutions, and more refined moral sensibilities. The process is neither smooth nor guaranteed, but it exhibits an overall direction toward greater realization of human rational capacities. Even before Kant's death in 1804, his philosophical revolution was beginning to transform intellectual life throughout Europe. The critical philosophy posed challenges that no serious thinker could ignore, while the systematic scope of Kant's achievement provided a model for philosophical ambition that would influence generations of subsequent philosophers. The immediate response to Kant's work was often bewilderment. The Critique of Pure Reason was notoriously difficult to understand, written in a technical vocabulary that Kant had largely invented and organized according to architectural principles that were not immediately apparent to readers. Early reviewers often missed the revolutionary significance of Kant's arguments, focusing on particular claims rather than grasping the systematic transformation he was proposing. But gradually, as readers worked through the complexities of Kant's system, its revolutionary implications became clear. If Kant was correct, then most previous philosophy had been based on fundamentally mistaken assumptions about the relationship between mind and reality. Traditional metaphysics, empiricist epistemology, and rationalist system building all required fundamental reconstruction in light of critical insights. The first generation of post-Kantian philosophers, figures like Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, accepted Kant's critical approach while attempting to overcome what they saw as unsatisfactory features of his system. They were particularly troubled by Kant's distinction between phenomena and things in themselves, which seemed to limit human knowledge in ways that were both unnecessary and philosophically problematic. Fichte argued that the thing in itself was an unnecessary remnant of pre-critical thinking and attempted to derive both subjective and objective aspects of experience from the activity of a fundamental ego. Schelling developed a more naturalistic approach that sought to understand mind and nature as different aspects of a single underlying reality. Hegel created the most ambitious post-Kantian system, arguing that reality itself had the structure of reason and could therefore be completely comprehended through philosophical thinking. These German idealists, as they came to be known, extended Kant's revolution in directions he would not have approved, but they testified to the power and fecundity of his fundamental insights. Even when they disagreed with Kant's specific conclusions, they accepted his view that philosophy must begin with critical reflection on the conditions of knowledge and experience. The influence of Kant's moral philosophy was equally profound. His emphasis on rational autonomy and human dignity provided philosophical foundations for liberal political movements throughout Europe and America. The categorical imperative offered a way of thinking about ethics that was both universal in scope and respectful of cultural diversity, since it focused on the form of moral reasoning rather than specific cultural content. Kant's aesthetic theory revolutionized thinking about art and beauty. His analysis of aesthetic judgment as involving the free play of cognitive faculties influenced Romantic theories of artistic creativity and provided a framework for understanding how art could be both meaningfully interpreted and irreducible to conceptual analysis. The notion of aesthetic education as preparation for moral judgment became central to liberal educational theory. Even thinkers who rejected Kant's specific conclusions found themselves responding to questions he had posed and adopting methods he had developed. Arthur Schopenhauer, despite his fundamental disagreement with Kant's ethical optimism, built his pessimistic philosophy on Kantian foundations. John Stuart Mill's empiricism was formulated partly in response to Kantian challenges to traditional British philosophy. In the 20th century, Kant's influence continued to be felt across diverse philosophical traditions. Logical positivists found in Kant's analysis of synthetic a priori judgments a model for understanding the relationship between logic and empirical knowledge. Existentialists drew on Kant's emphasis on human freedom and responsibility while rejecting his confidence in rational morality. Analytic philosophers adopted Kantian approaches to conceptual analysis while abandoning his systematic ambitions. Contemporary philosophy in both continental and analytic traditions continues to wrestle with fundamentally Kantian questions. How is objective knowledge possible? What is the relationship between scientific and moral reasoning? How should we understand the nature of human rational agency? What are the conditions for legitimate political authority? These questions may receive different answers today than Kant provided, but they remain central to philosophical inquiry largely because of the power and clarity with which Kant first formulated them. As Kant entered his 70s, the precise routine that had structured his life for decades began to show signs of strain. His health, never robust, became increasingly fragile. The sharp mind that had revolutionized philosophy started to show signs of age, though he continued his daily walks and dinner parties with characteristic determination. The political upheavals of the 1790s, the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, the transformation of European society, provided a constant backdrop to Kant's final years. He followed these events with intense interest, seeing in them both the promise and the dangers of the Enlightenment ideals he had championed. The revolution's initial commitment to rational principles of government excited him, but its descent into terror confirmed his belief that political change must be gradual and lawful to be lasting. Kant's last major work, The Conflict of the Faculties, 1798, addressed questions about the relationship between philosophy and other forms of knowledge, particularly theology and law. Even in his final years, he remained committed to the critical examination of human reason and its proper domains. Philosophy, he argued, must maintain its independence from political and religious authority while acknowledging the legitimate roles that faith and practical judgment play in human life. The aging philosopher also became something of a tourist attraction in Königsberg. Visitors from across Europe would come to observe the famous Kant in his natural habitat, often expecting to meet an intimidating academic but discovering instead a gracious host with wide-ranging interests and considerable charm. He remained curious about world events, fascinated by new scientific discoveries, and committed to the social obligations that had always been part of his daily routine. But gradually, the intellectual powers that had produced the critical philosophy began to fade. Kant's memory became unreliable, his concentration wavered, and the systematic thinking that had been his greatest strength became increasingly difficult to sustain. He recognized these changes with characteristic honesty, adjusting his routine to accommodate his diminished capacities while maintaining his essential dignity and good humor. The famous walks continued even as Kant's physical strength declined. Local residents, who had set their clocks by his punctual appearance for decades, watched with concern as his step became slower and his route sometimes varied from the established pattern. But he persisted in this ritual as long as he was physically able, understanding perhaps that the rhythm of walking had been essential to the rhythm of thought that had made his philosophical achievement possible. Kant's last years were also marked by increasing recognition of his historical significance. Even those who disagreed with his philosophical conclusions acknowledged that he had fundamentally altered the landscape of human thought. Students and admirers came from across Europe to pay their respects to the philosopher whose ideas were reshaping intellectual life throughout the continent. He died peacefully on February 12, 1804, at the age of 79, having lived to see his philosophical revolution begin to transform intellectual culture across Europe and beyond. His last recorded words, spoken in Latin, were "Es ist gut," it is good. A fitting final statement from a philosopher who had devoted his life to understanding the conditions under which human existence could be meaningful and worthwhile. More than 2 centuries after Kant's death, his intellectual revolution continues to shape how we think about fundamental questions of knowledge, morality, politics, and human nature. In an era of rapid technological change, global interconnection, and cultural diversity, Kantian insights remain remarkably relevant to contemporary challenges. Kant's emphasis on rational autonomy as the foundation of human dignity provides crucial resources for thinking about bioethics, artificial intelligence, and other areas where technological development raises fundamental questions about what it means to be human. His categorical imperative offers a framework for evaluating moral questions that arise in increasingly complex global societies where different cultural traditions must coexist. The political philosophy that Kant developed in works like Toward Perpetual Peace anticipated many features of modern international law and democratic governance. His vision of a confederation of republican states resolving disputes through legal rather than military means provided philosophical foundations for institutions like the United Nations and the European Union. His analysis of the conditions necessary for lasting peace remains relevant to contemporary discussions of international relations and global governance. Kant's aesthetic theory continues to influence how we think about art, beauty, and cultural meaning. His analysis of aesthetic judgment as involving the free play of cognitive faculties provides insight into why artistic experience feels both deeply personal and universally shareable. His notion of aesthetic education as preparation for moral judgment offers resources for thinking about the role of arts education in democratic societies. Even Kant's epistemology, despite developments in science and logic that he could not have anticipated, continues to provide insights into fundamental questions about the nature of knowledge and reality. His recognition that human minds actively contribute to the structure of experience rather than passively recording it prefigured important developments in psychology, cognitive science, and philosophy of science. Perhaps most importantly, Kant's example as a thinker demonstrates the possibility of revolutionary insight emerging from disciplined attention to fundamental questions. His achievement suggests that the most profound discoveries about human nature and possibility may come not from dramatic adventures or exotic experiences, but from patient, systematic reflection on the basic structures of rational experience. The routine that made Kant a figure of fun to some of his contemporaries, the precise schedule, the invariable walk, the methodical approach to daily life, was actually the foundation for one of the most creative and influential intellectual achievements in human history. By eliminating trivial decisions and distractions, Kant freed his mental energy for the deep thinking that his philosophical project required. This lesson remains relevant in an era of constant distraction and information overload. Kant's example suggests that meaningful intellectual achievement requires not just intelligence and education, but also the discipline to create space for sustained reflection. The depth of insight that produces lasting contributions to human understanding emerges from the kind of patient, systematic thinking that characterized Kant's approach to philosophical questions. As the morning mist rises from the Pregel River and the first light illuminates the ancient streets of what was once Königsberg, it is fitting to reflect on the extraordinary legacy of the small, punctual man who walked these streets for nearly 8 decades without ever venturing far from home. Immanuel Kant's life reminds us that the most profound revolutions often begin not with dramatic gestures or heroic adventures, but with quiet dedication to asking the right questions and thinking them through with complete honesty and rigor. In a world that often equates significance with spectacle and importance with celebrity, Kant's example stands as a powerful reminder that the deepest insights into human nature and possibility emerge from the disciplined work of reflection rather than from external drama or adventure. The man who never left his hometown changed how we understand knowledge, morality, beauty, and human nature itself. Not because he traveled to exotic places or had unusual experiences, but because he was willing to think with unprecedented clarity and systematicity about the basic structures of human experience. Kant's revolution was not destructive but constructive. By showing the limits of traditional approaches to fundamental questions, he cleared space for new and more adequate ways of understanding ourselves and our world. His critical philosophy did not aim to undermine confidence in human reason, but to put rational inquiry on firmer foundations by understanding clearly what reason can and cannot legitimately claim to achieve. The categorical imperative did not make moral decision-making easier, but it provided a framework for thinking about ethical questions that respects both the universal character of moral principles and the dignity of individual rational agents. Kant's political philosophy did not promise easy solutions to problems of governance and international relations, but it offered realistic hope that human societies could gradually approximate ideals of justice and peace through institutional development guided by moral principles. Perhaps most importantly, Kant's life and work demonstrate that intellectual achievement of the highest order is compatible with, indeed may require, personal modesty, social responsibility, and commitment to the welfare of others. The philosopher who revolutionized human thought was also the dinner host who delighted his guests with wit and conversation, the teacher who made complex ideas accessible to students, and the citizen who fulfilled his obligations to community and country. The quiet routine that structured Kant's daily life was not rigid obsessiveness, but rather a conscious strategy for maximizing intellectual productivity while maintaining the social connections and personal practices necessary for a fully human life. By organizing his time carefully, Kant was able to devote sustained attention to questions that required years or decades of patient thinking, while also fulfilling his obligations as teacher, friend, and member of the community. As we face contemporary challenges that would have been unimaginable in Kant's era, artificial intelligence, global climate change, cultural conflicts arising from unprecedented interconnection, we can still learn from his fundamental insight that the most important questions require the kind of sustained, systematic thinking that can only emerge from disciplined intellectual habits and genuine commitment to understanding truth. The man who never left Königsberg created intellectual resources that continue to help us navigate problems that span the globe. His example suggests that the depth of insight matters more than the breadth of experience, that systematic thinking produces more lasting contributions than superficial innovation, and that the patient work of understanding fundamental principles provides better guidance than quick responses to immediate pressures. In our age of rapid communication and constant distraction, Kant's daily routine offers a model for creating the conditions necessary for deep thinking. His commitment to regular reflection, his willingness to spend years working through difficult problems, and his recognition that meaningful insight requires freedom from trivial decisions and unnecessary complications remain relevant guides for anyone seeking to understand complex questions or make lasting contributions to human knowledge. The sunrise that illuminated Kant's study window each morning as he began his daily work of thinking through fundamental questions continues to rise over the world. He helped us understand more clearly. The questions he asked: what can we know? What should we do? What may we hope for? What is human being? Remains as important today as they were in 18th century Prussia. And the example he set of approaching these questions with intellectual honesty, systematic rigor, and deep respect for human dignity continues to provide guidance for anyone seeking to live a thoughtful and meaningful life. Immanuel Kant never left his hometown, but his thoughts traveled around the world and continue to shape how human beings understand themselves and their possibilities. In the quiet routine of a provincial professor, a revolution was born that continues to transform how we see the universe and our place within it. The man who changed everything did so not by going everywhere, but by thinking deeply about what it means to be human, to know, to act morally, and to hope for a better world. If you enjoyed this journey through the revolutionary mind of Immanuel Kant, please consider liking this video and subscribing to History Bedtime Stories for more deep dives into the fascinating lives of history's most influential thinkers. What questions about knowledge, morality, or human nature would you like us to explore next? Let us know in the comments below, and as always, sweet dreams and happy learning.